Sabrina 2000s comic, issue 101. We see Salem starting to tell Sabrina about his life when he was a little kid living on a farm. It's good that Sabrina's drawn better than usual in this comic, and that this was kept to one little panel to get right into the story. It's unusually fast pacing, and then the pacing goes back to being too slow by wasting our time with an alien wanting to get back at Salem for a while, when we have no reason to care what's going on because we don't know what he did or who this person is. Why does this comic have non-witches in the magic realm most of the time? It doesn't feel like it's taking advantage of the concept of a witch realm if they almost never look like witches or even humans. I'm forced to assume that Salem's choosing not to just warp home because he's having fun avoiding his attacks. Eventually, Salem runs off a cliff and ends up sitting in a swamp. Lucky for him, the guy who hates him decides to walk away after that, when he was dead set on beating him up before. It's also shocking that the comic was allowed to have him say he's going back home for a drink. He says he'll get him one too, unless he had his fill. Why would he say that if he doesn't mean it? Why would Salem go steal alcohol instead of zapping it up? If it's just a drink of water, that's not how people talk. He wouldn't talk like that to mean water. Just because he's in the witch realm, instead of him having a normal life that's easier to believe, Salem gets talked to by a frog who says he's like him. He must not be very interested in socializing because he immediately decides to undo any talking spell that was put on him, assuming that he's just a regular frog even though he has a name. It's a kind of name that made me immediately assume he wasn't a normal frog. For no reason, Salem's attempt to make him go back to croaking only burns him, which makes no sense because he would have had to imagine that for it to happen. And what makes even less sense is that he doesn't even succeed in getting rid of his ability to talk. And he says he's a cursed warlock. How is that supposed to explain why Salem can't do that to him? That's blatantly bullshit because Salem's had his ability to talk removed before in the franchise despite being a cat, which proves that it's possible to use magic against a transformed witch. The frog Toadicus is wearing a ring that turned him into a frog, but also prevented the curse. It's part of a set, and when wearing it with its pendant mate, he's a human. But they're separated, and he wants his help to get the pendant back. Someone would have to intentionally make it so that you would turn into a frog if you didn't wear both of them at once. Why would someone do that in the first place? If a person's making the magical artifacts for himself, why would he intentionally make it so that he'd have to wear both or he'd get turned into a frog? It would only make sense if that was the case for people other than the one who's supposed to be wearing the ring and pendant as a punishment for stealing. It's immediately obvious that Salem could just warp the pendant to him, as witches can warp things, and cast a spell to get information like where someone is. He could use a crystal ball to see where it is, so if the excuse is that he can't see it in the place it's at, that excuse doesn't work. So there's no excuse for him thinking that he has to tell Salem to go to a cave to get it. So just like I thought, the entire story arc has no reason to happen. I'm assuming that Salem can't just point to make it so that the ring doesn't keep him a frog anymore, because he already failed at making the frog unable to talk. But if the ring could be affected by magic, then that'd be another plot hole. I guess Salem assumes the ring can't be altered by magic, and that's why he doesn't try to use it on it. I'm wondering why Toadicus would have ever started wearing the pendant and ring if there was any risk of him being stuck as a frog. Because you would already think he's capable enough as a witch. Why doesn't the next page explain that? Obviously he'd have to be forced into it, or the ring or pendant gives him so much extra power when together that he'd want to keep them. I think the only reason a witch would want extra power is because they're power hungry and want to take over the world, or at least a town, because that's like Bosblink. Isn't it possible that he could just be lying? That's literally as simple as it looks and he's a frog because the council turned him into one as a punishment? He could just be saying that the pendant is his to trick Salem into getting it. Maybe he wants him to get him the mountains of treasure that he insists on telling him about when supposedly he just wants the pendant. Then why doesn't he just ask Salem to summon treasure like that? Salem has no reason to put himself through the trouble of going all the way to a cave to get treasure because he could just zap up treasure. like he did in the animated series comic where Landra, a character in the manga, was introduced. Witches are capable of summoning practically anything, even in just the manga, so there's no reason they'd be unable to summon gold or jewels if they can change the atomic number of something. You'd think Toadicus would know that and think Salem would just zap up the treasure instead of seeing it as a good incentive to follow his orders. You might as well have a normal human character if you forget it can cast a spell for something at literally every opportunity. At that point, it should have been a human, and it shouldn't be in the Sabrina series, because it just makes the story look arbitrary when I know everything it established witches to be capable of. Toadicus tells Salem that when he's human again, he'll give him free magic lessons. That's another incentive to help him. He must be great at magic compared to other witches if he's not just saying this. Although I don't see what exactly could make a witch great at magic in ways that would be useful to them every day compared to other witches. Teleportation and telekinesis are so useful for making daily life more convenient that they'd be the main powers a witch would be using while everything else would be seen as unnecessary. And I'm sure they'd be easy to do as they're easy to visualize. So how could his magic lessons be useful to him if they're going to cover spells he doesn't want to use? Salem says that his mom said the crops didn't do well last season, so the treasure could help her. But magic would have a spell to make sure the crops would do well. Why wouldn't witch farmers be allowed to cast a spell to determine the exact weather for their farm for a while to make sure the crops would turn out well? We know witches can summon and shapeshift things, so obviously that'd mean they could improve a crop. And that's ridiculous that I was expected to believe that bringing dead plants back to life is impossible for most witches. And he'd know he could zap up treasure, and even if he couldn't, almost everything has financial value as well. So even summoning a lot of non-treasure would still give her a way to make money that'd be far easier and quicker than this way. For example, he could summon dishwashers to sell. Salem also says that he likes the idea of powerful magic, which is stupid since I bet he's already perfect at every spell to make his life more convenient. So what would being better at magic change about his life? We haven't seen him complain about the state of affairs of the world, so it's not implying that he wants to take over the world now. I've seen Sabrina zap her homework to perfection to get A's, and that was in the era right before the manga started. But no, Salem's easily convinced even without being told the specific spells that he'd teach him, because he's a dumb kid who doesn't think. Oh, but he does think to tell his mom he's going out first, because that's common sense to avoid her getting worried and punishing him. Toadicus tells him to keep this between them, which is an obvious red flag right there. As if he was someone that he should be helping, that people would want him to help, he would have nothing to worry about with telling people that he's going to help him. I guess Salem assumes that he wants this a secret because he's embarrassed that he got stuck as a frog after someone stole his pendant when he was sleeping and brought it to the cave. Which isn't even something he says to him. If someone stole something from him when he was sleeping, how would he know that it was brought to a specific place? Salem must be assuming that. How could the pendant be his if it's all the way in a cave? Why wouldn't he be in the cave? Why would someone who would steal his pendant leave his ring alone? Why wouldn't he have told Salem that someone stole the pendant? So this better be leading up to a twist where the frog just wants to steal the pendant from the owner of the treasure. Salem goes to his mother who says he's wet. So he uses magic to make himself dry, which makes me wonder why he didn't care enough to do that right away. Good, at least he succeeded in that spell. It's sad that I have to compliment this, but he's been so incompetent at remembering how useful his magic can be that I was surprised he did this. If he keeps calling himself a master wizard, even as a kid, why does he even think he would need magic lessons? Why would he think he could be made more powerful? He's already arrogant if he thinks he's a master wizard. She says she thought he was helping someone clear the rocks from his field. That would take 1 second for a witch to do. Just make them vanish or teleport them to his own yard. I assumed that his neighbor thought Salem's mother was too busy with housework to clear the rocks herself. Salem's mother says she wants to know why Mr. Armstrong was trying to smash Salem, which of course would be illegal. Why didn't she ask him the second he showed up at her house? Mr. Armstrong says that Salem wasn't in any danger, which must be a lie because he acted dangerous before. Salem had said he'd enchant the hammers for him, but instead of breaking stones, they're harmless and make a squeaking noise. The only reason that happened is if Salem did that on purpose for the laughs. But it'd take 1 second for him to undo the spell and make the hammers break the rocks. I wonder if he did this because he has a grudge against Mr. Armstrong. Salem's mom thinks it's funny, implying that she's where he got his evil from. So the guy that Salem antagonized out of sadism expects me to believe that he was hammering on that rock for an hour. No, he would have realized that the hammer didn't work the second that it didn't instantly break the rock, and he would have gone after Salem or went to his mother in seconds. I always assume that the people that don't look like witches like him don't have powers of their own. Salem tries to make him think he's weak to get back at him for being mean to him at the start of the story. After Salem's mother tries to keep that guy from fighting with him because of a mistake he could have easily not made, all of a sudden Salem's uncle Mort shows up, who is the father he never had. It's obvious that the only reason for this is that Salem's the main character, so the writer feels obligated to make him more interesting. I thought he was already interesting by not having a father around. But if you had a father figure in his life anyways, then that's more boring than I expected. Especially since personally I already saw Sonic having an Uncle Chuck, not to mention Bunny having an uncle. It couldn't have been that hard to come up with. Salem hugs him as I think of how sad it is to see his family when they probably want nothing to do with him in the present day, or aren't alive anymore, because we never see them. If they got sick of him eventually, then their affection for him is going to seem shallow. Already we've got 2 pages of Mort in the story and I'm really bored. I think he's wasting a lot of valuable comic space with boring dialogue when we should have seen Salem set off on his quest by now. He found tumble truffles only found in rock slides and he's told to stop his dangerous games. Salem keeps trying to get his attention and asks if he really flew through a rock slide to get those. Why would he ask that if he'd know he did for sure? Mort seems impossibly stupid if he did that for fun, instead of just summoning tumble truffles. So there seems to be no excuse for why he's still alive, and thus wasting pages. I wonder if her saying he's gonna get hurt is foreshadowing that he's gonna get hurt. Salem says he's got his next adventure lined up, hopefully implying that they go on adventures a lot. But I bet Mort's not gonna be allowed to go with him, because it's a story about Salem. It's already bad enough that he's got a talking frog with him out of nowhere because of the meta reason that he just has to have someone to talk to, purely to pad out the story with that. It was marketed as a Salem arc, not an arc where Salem goes on a journey with some new characters that don't need to exist. Salem's mom says no and pointlessly reminds Mort of where Salem lives. Salem decides to get rid of the spell on the hammer when Armstrong's using it on himself when he already demonstrated how he had changed it. So he could have easily not hurt himself. So I assume the reason Salem's mom is letting them go out after that is that if she made them stay here, Armstrong would fight with Salem, even though he's got 2 all-powerful witches there who would effortlessly stop him. It was always obvious that Salem could just use magic to move really fast and fly to get to his destination in mere seconds. At least they are gonna fly on a broom. So you'd think that all they'd have to do is follow the frog's directions to get to the cave in a couple of seconds, because a broom that flies from your thoughts could fly as fast as you'd want. Especially since I assumed that it would have a spell on it so that you wouldn't get flung off it or suffer negative effects from G-force. Salem says they're doing this for treasure, which implies that the comic skipped past him telling him about the treasure, which is good pacing. But again, the writer misunderstands the franchise because now these characters are wearing goggles just because they're flying on a broom, which has never happened before, so it was common sense to assume that it was that way for a reason. The goggles look nice, but it just makes me wonder why no one wore goggles on a broom before if they're apparently considered mandatory safety gear. I know the meta reason for why no one wears them. It's because whoever imagines witches wearing goggles on a broom? An invisible force field in front of the witch's face could easily keep them from flying into bugs. But you'd think at that point she'd make it extend around the whole broom, and then we couldn't have had all those gags where the witches hate flying in the rain. A short flight later, they were in the northern woods. I'm glad it was that fast, but why won't they make themselves have super speed and reflexes to get to their destination in seconds? Salem gets asked how he heard about this place. Why didn't he ask him this right away? So apparently he really didn't tell him about Toticus just because he was told to keep him a secret, and instead got away with just telling Mort to go to a cave because he heard it had treasure. He says he knows about it from rumors. That couldn't be the case because anyone who'd find the treasure would take it home, not spread rumors about it being there. And he'd know that. The original owner of the treasure wouldn't go telling everyone about it, because that would only encourage people to go look for it. I assume there's people living in that cave to ward off intruders most of the time. Toadicus says at last, Salem grabs him and says that at last they're here. It's obvious that Mort would know that wasn't Salem's voice, and that Toadicus would know that Mort was with them, because he's not deaf, so he wouldn't have made his presence known. Oh good, at least Mort did notice the frog. Salem was so stupid the whole story for no reason that I thought he'd be oblivious too for no reason. Salem makes it obvious that he's lying to him because he hesitates before saying that he's his new familiar. So there's no reason Mort would believe him, because if he was telling the truth, he would have no reason to pause. Not to mention it's a bit confusing that the concept of familiars for witches is being treated so casually as a normal part of this world, because familiars have been ignored since the end of the Archie's Madhouse stories. He should have just said pet. Saying familiar implies that witches need them for their magic when they almost never have, so why won't they just be called pets? Salem's mom is called a cat person while Salem hates cats. They go into a cave, and he's told to keep close to him because this opening resembles the entrance to a lizard-mine temple out of nowhere. It's off-putting that Salem and Mort know what lizard-mine are when I don't, and are scared despite being witches. He reassures Salem that once he's restored to normal, nobody would dare challenge their might. You'd think that nobody would challenge him the way he is already, because he can already summon and teleport, to say the least. But Mr. Armstrong still tried to fight with him, so he has no reason to actually believe this. Also, him saying this makes him look like a power-hungry would-be conqueror, so you'd think Salem would take that info in. How's a cave slimy? Must be pretty magical. He asks where his uncle is and wants out of the cave. There's absolutely no believability in Mort not being around him anymore when he told him to stay close to him. He could have held his hand. And they're in a cave, in a bunch of narrow tunnels. Mort would have noticed he wasn't close to him anymore instantly and warps to him. He'd noticed that he wasn't hearing him walk behind him right away. He'd have heard that the voices of Salem and that frog were getting quieter, and thus further away. It's so ridiculous that I'm expected to believe they'd get separated for no reason and stay that way this long for drama. Why does the story expect me to take it seriously? Salem says that maybe if he takes the other tunnel, it won't be so hot. He hears Mort scream and tell him to come quick. Why would an all-powerful witch scream for help? Why did Salem look scared at all? He was only screaming because he found gold. Then why did he go ah, like he was scared? They've already found the gold. So I'm guessing that's not going to be as simple as them getting to warp it home and spend the money from it right away. But that would only make sense if the gold was cursed and the curse was bad enough that they wouldn't get to take advantage of it before deciding to get rid of it. The story ends with lizard people being behind them. And I'm expected to believe that's what they're going to have to be scared of. When witches can teleport themselves and objects, not to mention freeze time. So there's no logical reason that they'd be in danger. They'd just get the gold home in a second. They'd have already done it by now. The story shouldn't be about witches if it just creates plot holes. Not to mention that it always felt arbitrary that there were lizard people. The witch realm already had monsters and weird looking people in it, and already that's annoying because it seems to be the majority in what's supposed to be the native planet of humans with magic. So that's not how anyone would imagine that realm to be like. It would have felt less arbitrary if these weren't animal people out of nowhere, and instead elves, or some other mythological monster. They're lizard people to be intimidating, but they could be intimidating as dragon people, and that'd feel mystical instead of arbitrary. Because I'm just thinking that these people could have easily not been a part of Salem's world when they came out of nowhere. Wait, this was by Ian Flynn? Are you kidding me? I assumed it was going to be by Tanya Del Rio because the rest of the manga was by her. If they're going to get someone else to write the comic, I don't understand why it was him. Someone that I assume has no experience with the Sabrina series, if this supposedly magical issue is written like that. This ridiculous issue is about a kid Salem being told by a transformed witch to go find a magical pendant to bring him back to normal. So instead of a witch that can summon and warp doing that to get it, instead of him casting a spell to see the pendant in a crystal ball or brew and warping the pendant to him, Salem insists on going to the cave himself, with an impossibly stupid uncle that could have easily not existed and wasted comic space in us. If he thinks he can only warp himself somehow from force of habit, he could have seen and warped to the pendant himself and then back home. Maybe witch parents always discourage their kids from warping to places they could easily walk to in not such a large amount of time, because they'd exhaust all of their magic too fast. So witch kids get into the habit of walking everywhere and not thinking to warp. But you would think that someone wouldn't forget that they have teleportation power. This story is so stupid. With the exception of Salem's mom, everybody in the story doesn't seem like they have a functioning brain. They do nothing but get idiot balls over and over again. I'm expecting to believe witches would be in trouble just because there's people guarding the treasure. They'd warp home with it in a second. Salem would have summoned a treasure right away. As usual, it was even worse than I expected. I thought Salem would go on the adventure alone, or at least have one person to talk to, not have an uncle who's too stupid to even keep close to him.